So the next thing we said that we would talk about is primer and undercoats. This is a common misunderstanding. In the single pack world especially, the undercoat term is really very English thing, and generally in Europe, there's just a primer. There is two purposes. So traditionally, a primer is about adhesion, so sticking to the wood or the steel or the aluminium or GRP, and the undercoat is to build a base layer that's got the right finish on it to put a top coat. But actually, in most cases, in the single pack world, throughout Europe, they're the same thing. In the two-pack world, it can be slightly different, but still mainly in the epoxy primers we use in the two-pack world, they're still the same. We just have a primer and a primer. Let's have a look forwards, staying with the inland waterways. We've got here a narrowboat. Now, this has been had Multi Marine Primer added to it. And Multi Marine Primer is actually quite a modern product. It's not an old traditional product like most of the Epifanes. It's got a lot of modern technology, and this is where modern technology helps us because it sticks really well to the steels and the aluminiums and stainless and all those things. There isn't much Multi Marine Primer won't stick to. But here, quite often in a narrowboat, we would put, in this case, red onto the steel first, maybe. And then you may switch into a grey or a white. You put another couple of coats of grey or white over, and that's your base for your top coat. You're still using the same product. But as you're sanding back your primer, ready for your top coat, if you start seeing that red grinning through, you know you're getting near to the steel. And you can stop. You may need more primer. But if you stop before you go back to the steel, you're not worrying about repriming the steel. So a handy trick on steel boats is to make sure that you don't rub through back to the steel. Change of color helps that. Just here, there's another example. So we talk about Multi Marine Primer would be your primer, and then the old undercoat is Epigrond, as it was known in Holland, but the undercoat goes over the top. The undercoat on the right there is an alkyd based, which is a one component. Alkyd just says it's an older traditional paint system, and so you still can do it. If you want to do it, you can go with the Multi Marine Primer, then go to the undercoat afterwards. Other paint systems have the same sort of combinations, but in most cases these days we follow our primer with a primer and then go to top coat. Again, in the two-pack world, there are some exceptions, but there are epoxy and polyurethane primers. Either can be used. It's quite a big subject, so if anyone's got any questions on that, just give us a shout, or go to the systems advice booklet that Epifanes do, which has got the systems in it that you can use for various steel and aluminium. Sanding primers is also a big subject. Here we have a picture of an electric DA sander on the right. Dual action sander, so it has a off-center weight, which means it goes around in circles and in bigger circles. It's almost gyroscopic. So and the pros use these all the time. We traditionally at home we've got sort of small square sanders and things like that, which just go round once. You can get these now if you're doing large areas. It's probably worth the investment. You can get them from most DIY stores. Do a fairly cheap version. The pros use 150 mil diameter. The sort of more home use ones tend to be 100 mil diameter, but these days in the DIY stores you can get both. So these help do the large areas. The big problem we see with sanding is often when you're sanding not the big areas which you do by machine, or you're doing small areas by hand. Now, obviously, I've got a picture of a guy with a longboard in his hand there. He's doing filling and fairing, which again is another bigger subject. But you put scratches in with that. And if you're using silicon carbide paper, better known as wet and dry, it's very sharp. So, for instance, if you were preparing for a top coat, you might be sanding with a 320 grit sandpaper on your machine. Well, if you went to a 320 grit on a wet and dry, you'll see the sanding marks. So, a couple of tips. Wet and dry only, go up to 600, 500, 600 for your hand sanding. Then undo your hand sanding first, and then bring the machine up over the top of the hand sanding so the machine gets rid of most of it, because it'll always be finer by machine. So just a little tip, just go up a grade or two when you're hand sanding. Don't go up to 600 on the machine sand. It will be then too smooth for the paint to stick, and you'll have an adhesion problem just for the hand sanding. So cleaning, big subject. I was trying to look for an image. I'm sorry. Wax on, wax off from Karate Kid was the best I could do. But cleaning is something that we quite often get wrong. Pros and amateurs alike. The Epifanes spray thinners is what we recommend to clean. In the single pack, well, it's a white spirit based thinners. It's quite slow, it's quite oily, it's designed as like a grease for the paint, so it's not ideal for cleaning. Spray thinners is, which single pack you're allowed to buy, by the way, because it's not in polyurethane. Spray thinners is slower curing, so you can put it on with a cloth. We call it the 2-cloth method. Every paint company in the world suggests this 2-cloth method. You apply some spray thinners to the surface with 1 cloth. Using a clean, dry cloth, you remove it and wipe it off the surface. Lots of people say, oh, use acetone. Acetone's an aggressive solvent, very, very fast evaporating, and generally we don't recommend using it. There is an exception to the rule a little bit later on, but acetone will only just take a bit of sun cream and move it across the boat, but it'll leave it on the surface. You need to put the solvent on with one hand, and then with the new cloth on the other side, you need to remove it and dry it off. Don't let it dry on its own, dry it off. And change that rag. The other thing is people forget is cleaning before you start sanding. If you've got a top coat that's been out in use for ages, that's got sun cream, the remains of the gin and tonic, and all sorts of things that have been dribbled down it over the years. If you then sand that top coat, you're going to take all of those contaminants and put them into the surface. So clean it before you sand it, and then clean the primers before you apply the top coats. Make sure it's dry, but don't do it the night before. Do it the same day, but just make sure it's dry. And cleaning will help a lot. We'll talk a bit more about contamination later. But that's we're going to leave primers at that. It's a big to see if he's got any additions. Are you with us, Chris?
Hello. Yeah. Yes. So just one of the questions going back to there's a bit of a delay on the whole transmission system. So this is actually a question from just before the last questions, but. Craig asked, what strength thinners do you recommend for checking to see if paint on a GRP hull is 1 or 2 pack? We'd always recommend using the thinners for the paint that you're going to use, because that's what it's going to sit in, and that gives it the best sort of exposure. I think that's right, isn't it, Simon?
Yes, completely. Yeah, if you're going to put, whatever primer, it doesn't, and this is the same for all paints, it's not an Epifanes thing. Whatever primer you're going to use, or if you're going straight with top coat, use the thinners for that primer or that top coat, because that's what's going to hit that surface first, and that's what's going to do the damage or not do the damage.
Cool.
Any more?
No, I think that's it for now. I've got a slightly long one that I'm answering, but
okay, no problem. We'll move on. So the